Well, guys, here is the newest video I've been wanting to do about my Madden NFL 09's PSP Franchise series. I'm still wrapping up. I've been thinking about this for a while because I think it was the last video I did where I did like an in-depth game-by-game recap of the 2008 season and none of y'all got to saw. Well, I wanted to do that here as well for the 2009 season since that was the last season I played each game before the glitch or bug or whatever with the Bears and Bengals prevented me from playing them. Now, unfortunately, I can't go like completely in depth like last time because I don't have the schedule. I remember who played who mostly, but not the exact weeks or not, since that was a custom schedule instead of starting off with the real life 2008 schedule. So it's gonna be a little bit more of a recap highlight than otherwise. So here was how the 2009 season went. So in the AFC East, the Patriots, after they went 9-7 last year, they rebounded quite a bit as they went 12-4. Very strong season, made the playoffs for, like the 7th year in a row or whatever. But they were only able to get the 3rd seed still, despite the 12-4 record. The Dolphins, after they went 1-15 in 2007, they had that strong 2008 season where they finished 8-8. They had playoff aspirations in 2009, maybe to challenge the Patriots, but nope. They started off 1-4, and they did not look good. God, their Week 2 game, they were at the Colts on Monday night, which they had a big lead, but then they choked and lost at 34-28, which funny enough, the Colts and Dolphins did play each other Monday night in Week 2 in real life 2009, but the Dolphins were hosting it instead of the Colts. And then the next week they visited the Bills on Sunday night, and they won that like 16-3, and it was a defensive slugfest as neither offense got anything going. The team started off 1-4. They didn't look right whatsoever. They did rebound quite a bit afterwards, but by that point it was like largely too late for them as they regressed to 7-9, as it was their first losing season since 2007. Then the Bills, they had the worst record. They tied the Ravens for the worst record last year. They had number 1 overall pick. In the 2009 draft, they drafted Rob Carter to be their successor. However, he actually didn't get the starting job in going into 2009. It was still Trent Edwards. And I believe they hosted the Ravens in the first game too, which they won. So after that, the Bills were kind of like the Dolphins, just hanging around. Rob Carter really didn't get used much. He didn't start at all, I don't think. Only being used when like the game was out of reach or in a lead or whatever, not really using them correctly. But then the Bills, I think they were 4-4 at halfway through the season after they won another game, still hanging in there in the competitive AFC race. But then they went on to win like 3 in a row to go to 7-4, and they had this big lead. Yet despite that, they still didn't have a playoff spot at all. They weren't even in the playoffs. They were looking in still because the AFC was so loaded at this point in the season. But as you can see by the record, after they went 7-4, they lost all 5 of the remaining games to finish 7-9 and another losing season. But hey, after going 4-12 to 7-9, it was good progress. And that led to, and Trent Edwards' solid season would lead to him going to the Panthers next year and lead to the dynasty of the 2010s for him as Rob Carter became the starter next year. And the Jets, they just jetsted. They regressed to 5-11, just not looking right whatsoever. Alright, then the Steelers, they started off 2-2. They won their first game, I can't remember who it was though. Then they kind of got spanked, they lost to the Bengals hosting them. Then the next week they were at the Vikings, and they won on a last second slant Hail Mary touchdown pass on the final play of the game to win it. Then they hosted the Patriots last week and they got spanked. So they were 2-2, and I think they were last place in the AFC North, because everyone else was like 3-1 or something like that. But then they went on to lose only 1 game remaining as they went 13-3, and that was impressive due to the fact that 6 games left, Big Ben suffered a season-ending injury, so they had to rely on Charlie Batch the rest of the way. But despite that, they went 13-3, clinched the division again. They got first-round bye for the first time since 2004, and thanks to them beating the Colts earlier in the year, they actually got home field advantage. Impressive. As the Bengals, after they struggled last year to 7-9, they started off the year 3-0, I think, and they played pretty impressively offensively. But then they pretty much hit kind of like a real-life rut like they did in real life 2021 recently. They fell to, I think, 3-2. Then they went up to 5-2. Then they fell to 5-4. Then they went to 7-4. Then they fell to 7-6, including one of those losses to one of the worst teams in the league, the Packers. And it looked like they weren't even going to make the playoffs, as everyone else was like ahead of them in terms of the tiebreakers. But then they went on to win all 3 of the remaining games to finish 10-6 and clinching a playoff spot. Just like in real life, they made it to the playoffs in 2009 on a 10-6 record. Only they won the division that year. So then the Browns, of course, after they lost their first game, they won 4 in a row. Then they went all the way up to 7-3, and I believe they might have been leading the AFC North possibly at that point, because they had a strong start to the year. It looked like they were going to make the playoffs this year after missing out after they went 8-8 last year from their choke job. But then they went on to fall into a tailspin where they finished 9-7, missing out on the playoffs. If they won their final game, which I believe it was hosting the Steelers, if they won that, they could have gotten into the playoffs, but they couldn't do it. They choked at the end. And then the Ravens, they were pretty much 500 for most of the year, but they were still right there in the competitive AFC North. And they ended up finishing 8-7. They were 8-7. They had to beat the Chiefs the final week of the year to have any chance whatsoever of making the playoffs. But unfortunately for them, even though they won in a close one, they still couldn't make it into the playoffs with the tiebreakers. But hey, they went 9-7 after they went 4-12 the year before. And the AFC North in 2009 became the first division ever to have everyone with a winning record. But, damn, Ravens. 9-7, but even if the Browns got that tiebreaker instead of the Raiders, they still would have made the playoffs since only 2 wildcard teams were able to get in. Unfortunate for the Ravens. So anyways, in the AFC South, the Colts, they played just like they did last year pretty much. Instead, they improved to 13-3, and they got a crucial week 2 win. I know they won their first game of the year. Then I know they lost their second game of the year. I just don't remember who it was. Then the third game, they were at the Patriots, and they won it, which was crucial because that got them the first round bye. Because if they didn't get that, the Patriots would have gotten home field advantage, because then they would have beaten Steelers and the Colts in this scenario. But that's not what happened. 13-3, only missing out on home field advantage because they lost to the Steelers in the middle of the year. As the Texans, after they made the playoffs for the first time ever last year, they hope to have Super Bowl aspirations. They started off good at 2-0, but after that, they never really recovered. They were largely 500 for the rest of the year. They were not the same team as they were last year, as they regressed to 9-7, and they missed out on the playoffs to a tiebreaker over the Raiders, who beat them earlier in the year. Meanwhile, the Jaguars, after they regressed to 5-11 last year, they bombed out as they fell to 4-12. They were 2-12 at one point before they won their final 2 games. And the Titans, they completely fell off a cliff too, as boy did they collapse all the way down to 3-13, and Vince Young was done with the Titans after that one. So, then in the AFC West, the Chargers, after they fell short of the AFC Championship again last year, well, make it to Super Bowl, I mean, they started off the year 3-0, but then they largely kind of played like the Bengals did. They lost their next 2. Then they went to 4-2. Then they lost the next 2 to fall to 4-4. Then they went to 5-4. Then they lost again. They were leading the division at 5-5, and nothing was like going right for them. But then they somewhat rebounded barely. They had to win a whole bunch of close games during the stretch. They finished 10-6 and clinching the division once again, but this time falling down to the 4th seed. Meanwhile, the Raiders, the defending AFC champion, definitely had a Super Bowl hangover as they were at 500 for most of the year. I think they actually lost their first 2 games, if I remember correctly. And they managed to recover at the end of the year to finish 9-7 and was just enough to sneak into the playoffs this time around. And unfortunately for them, Jamarcus Russell, although he played good, he was not the same player as he was the year before. And that led to a massive feud between him and the Raiders organization that would eventually led him to being traded to the Dolphins in the offseason. And the Broncos played pretty much exactly how they did last year. Stayed around 500 for like the first half. Then they fell off a cliff at the beginning of the second half before they won like their final 4 games to finish 9-7, but not enough to make the playoffs. Meanwhile, then after that, it was the Chiefs, who, remember, they traded for Aaron Rodgers during the 2008 season. So this was going to be his first year as a starter. After having a strong season as a starter, the Chiefs had playoff aspirations. They thought they were going to make it to the playoffs this year. And then, of course, even though they weren't the Super Bowl champs, they hosted the kickoff game and they crushed the Broncos like 40-20 something. But then, the next week, they lost to the Chargers in overtime. Then, they got spanked by a Giants, but that was more because it was a very windy game and it fucked over the Chiefs really badly. But after that, the Chiefs never recovered. They had a stunningly terrible season where they finished 3-13, one of the worst records in the league. Absolutely stunning and an absolute disaster. It was not a season all the Chiefs fans were expected. Then after that, we go into the NFC as we start off with the Eagles, who, after they went 11-5 last year and almost made the NFC Championship, and they looked really strong outside of the NFC East, the Eagles were thought to be a Super Bowl contender. And at the beginning of the year, it was a disaster. They lost their first 2 games, and they played just terrible in those games. They played really, really bad. Like, everyone was thinking they were done already. They already wanted Andy Reid fired, McNabb gone, everything. Like, the whole team was just shit. Then they won their next 4 in a row, and that didn't solve anything, though. Then they lost. Then they won. Then they lost again. So now here they are 5-4, still right there in the playoff mix, though, in the NFC side. But the team was just not the same as it was last year. But then they went on to win 5 in a row to go to 10-4. Then they lost their final 2 games to finish 10-6 in a disappointing year. But despite that, not only did they make the playoffs, they won the NFC East because the Giants choked, and because of how weak the NFC was, they went 10-6 and still got first round bye for the first time since 2004. So the Eagles did improve in their playoff seeding despite the terrible season they had. Then the Giants. The Giants played exactly how they did last year. They were 9-2 at one point, and they just looked unstoppable. I know their one loss was to the Rams, but I can't remember their second loss. But they were 9-2, had a huge lead over the Eagles in the NFC East. Blowout lead against everyone else in the playoffs. It looked like they were going to easily win the division, easily get first round bye, and maybe have to challenge the Rams for home field advantage. But then the team fell apart the final 5 games as they lost all 5 of their games to finish 9-7 and just getting into the playoffs of the wild card, allowing the Eagles to clinch it. Complete disaster it was. I have no idea what happened to them. They lost to the Raiders, helping them get in. They lost to the Cowboys. They lost to the Eagles at one point, I think, during the stretch. Like, the team was just bad down the stretch. I have no idea what happened. It was just embarrassing. Alright, then the Redskins largely just played like last year, around 500. They did, however, pull off spoiler victories where they gave the Panthers and Bears their first loss of the year, where they started off 3-0. So very good for them in that regard. But they largely were just mediocre, and they finished 7-9, which is an improvement from last year by a game, as they still had a second straight losing season. The Cowboys, thank you. I don't know why you popped up there. Thank you. But anyways, the Cowboys, after having a terrible start to the year in 2008, then they had a strong rebound to finish 10-6, and they looked like they were going to compete for a Super Bowl as well. The Cowboys completely fell apart. They were terrible in 2009. Romo sucked, and he got injured for, I think, most of the season. So he was gone at the end of the year, and that led to Roy Kennedy, the quarterback they drafted second round, I think, in 2009 to take over. And he didn't really play that much better either, but he was the future for the Cowboys, at least for that moment, as they finished 5-11, and what a terrible, just terrible season they had. Then the Vikings in the NFC North. After they won it last year, they largely played how they did last year. Just 9-7, and they got the 3rd seed, barely making it in because of how weak the NFC North was. Then the Bears actually started off the year 3-0 before they lost to the Redskins, like I said. And then after that, they just were mediocre the rest of the way, as they went 7-9, but they got the 2nd seed in the playoffs. And Kyle Orton, he actually got a Pro Bowl, his first one of a several in a row coming up very soon that season. So the Bears had optimism going into 2010. So anyways, the Lions, of course, after they got rid of Matt Millen last year, they drafted Ed Bradford in the first round of 2009, hoping to be the successor that Matthew Stafford would be in real life. And they largely played just like how they did last year. They didn't start off terribly like they did in 2008, but they were largely 500 throughout the year. And at one point near the end of the year, they were 7-5, I believe, and right there leading to the NFC North like they did last year. But then they lost their final 4 games to finish 7-9, missing the playoffs again. Then the Packers, they were hoping that last year was just a terrible disaster at the end and they were going to make it back to the playoffs this year. Oh boy, they'd be wrong in the Brian Broham experience, as they were the last team winless. They started off 0-5 before they got their first win of the year at the Seahawks. And they beat the Vikings later on in the year, and then they beat the Bengals for their final win of the year, the future Super Bowl champion they beat. But otherwise, the season was an absolute disaster for him, as Mike McCarthy was fired and Brian Broham looked like a complete disaster, and all the fans began wondering, what if we had Aaron Rodgers instead of trade him away to the Chiefs, even though they went 3-13 as well? So then the NFC North, the Buccaneers, after they, remember last year they were 8-1, then they fell all the way down to 10-6 and barely snuck into the playoffs as the second seed before they lost to the Rams. They had a terrible start to the year. They were 0-4. They lost their first 4 games. And then at one point, they were, I think, 2-8 or 3-8. They were one of the worst teams in the league in terms of record, and looked like they were not going to at all make the playoffs. But then the unthinkable happened. With the NFC South being so weak, and the Buccaneers all of a sudden went on a roll, they won all 6 of their remaining games, or 5, whatever, to finish 8-8, and actually making the playoffs and clinching the division. What a stunning turnaround it was for the Buccaneers to still make the playoffs, although they still weren't a good team. Then the Falcons, they largely played around 500 all year. They had to win their final game of the year in order to have any chance to make the playoffs, which they did. Why you keep popping up? So they won that, and thanks to the Cardinals choking, the Falcons went 8-8, and they actually made the playoffs as the 6th seed. And the Panthers, I don't really want to talk about much because I want to save it before I do my Panthers Dynasty video, but they start off 3-0, looking really good, but then they largely just struggled the rest of the way. They were still leading the division for much of the year, and then the final week of the year, they were 7-8. If they won their final game in the year at the Saints, they would have the tiebreaker over the Buccaneers regardless, and the Falcons if how they ever do, and they would have won the division. But they blew it in a spectacular fashion, which I'll cover when I do that video. They lost. They went 7-9, their first losing season since 2007. They missed the playoffs after the 3-0 start, and John Fox was fired, and that would set the motion for them to become a future dynasty and win a Super Bowl 2 years later. The Saints, meanwhile, they played pretty much how they did last year. They actually gave the Eagles their first loss of the year in week 1 of their 2 losses. But then they fell apart completely. Unlike last year, though, where the start of the year was terrible because of their terrible defense, they lost Drew Brees for like the first half of the year. So the team largely just didn't have a quarterback, and it just was a struggle. Brees eventually came back, but by that point, the Saints were just too dead, pretty much. Like nothing, they had too terrible of a start to the year to recover, as they finished 7-9 for the 3rd year in a row and not making the playoffs. Although they did ruin the Panthers season, which unfortunately led to them being a powerful dynasty to challenge the Saints later on. Whoopsie. And of course they make the Super Bowl the next year. Then in the NFC West, the Rams as the defending champions played like how the Giants did in 2008. They started off 5-0 and looked really, really dominant. Then the next 3 weeks, they lost 2 out of the 3 where they got spanked at home by the Vikings and the Colts. But they were 6-2, still hanging in there as the number 1 spot in the division. And then they went on to win all the remaining games to finish 14-2 as the best record of any team in my series when I played them. Home field advantage wrapped up everything as they were destined to repeat. Then the Cardinals, after they started, remember, 4-1 last year, but then they lost 6 in a row, never recovered as they finished 8-8. Well, this year they started off 4-1 once again. But this time they actually looked really good during this time, as they actually improved to 7-3, and it looked like, because how weak the NFC was at that time, the Cardinals, even if they struggled, it looked like they were going to easily at least get a wild card spot and make the playoffs for the first time in 11 years. But then they lost 3 in a row. They then won a game, so they were 8-6, trying to get their first winning season in 11 years. Then the disaster happened. They visited the 49ers on the final Sunday night game of the year, and they got destroyed like 59-14 or something crazy like that. And in the final game of the year where they visited the Colts, they had to win in order to have any shot at making the playoffs. It was a close game, but in the end the Colts held on to win it to fall to 8-8 for the Cardinals. And they needed the Falcons to lose to have any remaining shot of making the playoffs, but they didn't. The Falcons won. That gave them the wild card spot remaining to get in, as the Cardinals missed it. Now, if the Panthers won, I think the Cardinals could have gotten in over the tiebreakers over everyone else, but that didn't happen. So, Ken Whisenhunt, I believe, was fired at the end of the year because of that this terrible finish, as just never went right for the Cardinals this series. Then the 49ers. They kind of played how they started in 2008, but this time they were 4-3. They were right there in the mix for a wild card spot in the NFC. But then they lost 2 disastrous games in a row where Alex Smith played so badly he was benched and was pretty much done for at the 49ers at that point. They brought someone else in for the rest of the season, and they just largely stayed mediocre the rest of the way as they finished 8-8, their first non-losing season since 2002. But it was not enough to make the playoffs with the tiebreakers. And the Seahawks largely played how they did last year's disappointing years. They finished 7-9 and missed out. So yeah, that's how the 2009 season went. And of course, there was the playoff stands, if y'all remember, because I talked about it in my long recap video of the series. In the AFC side, the Raiders visited the Patriots in a rematch from the wild card last year, but instead of it being an offensive overtime showcase, it was a defensive struggle where the Patriots just held on to get the revenge. Bengals at Chargers. The Bengals won that in a close one. Then the Bengals were at the Steelers where they embarrassed the Steelers. But of course the Steelers were the underdogs this game despite being the number 1 seed because no Big Ben, remember. No one really had any expectations for him once he went down. The Patriots at the Colts. The Colts won an offensive shootout and a close comeback victory. Then conference championship Bengals at Colts. The Colts being the Bengals. The game was tied, I think, at 32 at one point. But then the Bengals, with like 20 seconds left, got a field goal to take a 35-32 lead. And the Colts just could not get the field goal or touchdown time to save their chances, as the Bengals made the Super Bowl for the first time since 1988. Then in the NFC side, the Giants spanked the Buccaneers. The Vikings held on to beat a feisty Falcons team. Then the Giants embarrassed the Rams to make them go one and done as the defending champ, as they made it back to the conference championship and got revenge from last year's conference championship loss. The Eagles barely held on to beat the Vikings, and then the Eagles barely beat the Giants to make it to the Super Bowl for the first time since 2004. And then the Super Bowl, the first one filmed for YouTube in this series, where the Bengals won it like 45-41. Last second touchdown or so. Absolutely crazy season. Well, I hope you all enjoyed hearing the recap of the 2009 seasons. That was the last season I played all the games, but I still got more videos to do on this series before I'm finally wrapped it up, and I cannot wait to do so. So, see you guys next time.